So I apologize for the abrupt end to that last video. There were some issues with the audio that I had to cut off the last part for. So I'm squeezing in a part 1.5 here to talk about the influence of fossils on Darwin and his theory of evolution by natural selection. So he had been reading a lot around this time about strata. The laying down of different layers of rock in geology, and you can see these when there's either an uplift, which Darwin saw while he was in Ecuador, or when you have had something like the Grand Canyon, where you have a river carving out a lot of space, and you can see here that there are very obvious layers or strata here. And the idea goes that since this is sedimentary rock and sediments are piling up from the bottom up, these strata up here were created more recently, and these strata down here were formed longer ago. And Darwin noticed that as you look at the organisms, the fossils that you find in the lower strata, they tend to look a lot more different from the current life that we see on the surface than the strata that are closer to the surface, right? So you see fossils of organisms that exist right now in this upper strata, and as you go down, theoretically longer ago in the past, and now you can confirm that, right, with radioisotope dating, you see different organisms. Now this seems pretty straightforward, but the idea of fossils, and specifically of fossils of organisms that don't exist today, that was relatively new at the time. There was a French scientist named Cuvier who noted that there were extinction events, or seemed to be, because we'd find fossils of organisms that existed clearly before. We have their bones, but they don't seem to exist now. Actually, one of the earliest known events or discoveries that kind of showed this was over across the river in Boone County. There was a place called Big Bone Lick, and there were all these mastodon skulls and sets of bones and a lot of other fossils that had been found, and sort of invented the science of paleontology as we know it today. And again, this had a big impact on Darwin. Now, while Cuvier looked at these changes and between strata and assumed that there must be large catastrophes in between each strata, or in the border of each strata, there was another geologist named Charles Lyell who put forward this principle of uniformitarianism. He and James Hutton perceived that the changes could have been slower and taken sort of continuous action over a longer period of time, and that means that the Earth must have been a lot older than we thought it was, meaning 6,000 years old, based on a reading of the Bible. And Lyell's uniformitarianism was an idea that the laws that govern us right now, things like gravity, right, we can measure how that works. Those same laws were governing what happened years and years ago. So when we find lower levels of geology, lower levels of strata, they were formed by the same laws that are operating on the world now. And Darwin had a copy of Lyell's book with him while he was going around the world in the Beagle. And we've discussed how Darwin's ideas were influenced by a lot of science that had existed at the time, especially geologists like Lyell and some population science and things like that. But he wasn't even the first person to put forward a hypothesis that included evolution. He was just the first person to put forward the idea of evolution with the correct mechanism, natural selection. Before Darwin, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck put forward an idea of evolution that said that there was change over time, right, across populations, but that it didn't occur because of natural selection. It occurred because of use or disuse of a particular trait. For instance, they would both, Lamarck and Darwin, say that giraffes may have had shorter-necked ancestors, and the population changed over time, and then now they have long necks. But Lamarck would say that these shorter-necked ancestors just would reach up and reach up to get those leaves, and because they did so much reaching, their offspring had longer necks. And their offspring would reach and reach and reach for those leaves, and because they reached and reached and reached, their offspring would have longer necks. Darwin says there was just variation in the neck length originally, and the individuals, the ancestors that had longer necks, just tended to do better. They were better able to grab those leaves, and therefore they were able to have more offspring. And because these traits are heritable, their offspring happened to have longer necks. And then the next generation, there was also variation, and those with longer necks did better, and over lots and lots and lots of generations, you eventually get giraffes as we see them today. Lamarck used as evidence for his hypothesis the fact that blacksmiths, he did a lot of measurements and found that the sons of blacksmiths tend to have be bigger and have larger muscles than sons of tailors, I believe was the study. And he went out and did a lot of measurements, but he assumed that the reason they had stronger muscles is because their fathers had done a lot of hammering. When in reality, the more likely explanation is their fathers were probably blacksmiths because they had big muscles, right? And then those big muscles were heritable to the next generation, and so their sons, who also were working in the blacksmith factories and also had those big, strong muscle genes, would have bigger, stronger muscles than those who were tailors. If Lamarck's ideas were correct, then you might look at something like a bonsai tree, right, which has, over the course of its lifetime, it's been trimmed down to look like a very tiny big tree, right? It looks like a big tree that you shrunk in the wash. But when these things reproduce, they don't make tiny tree offspring. They make offspring that grow into a normal tree, unless you then again, in the next generation, cut them down.